Tēnā koutou katoa, te mana whenua, tēnā koutou. Thank you for having me here. It's such an honor to have been invited to be able to speak in this amazing space and share with you my journey in research and some of the discoveries that we've been making over the last, for me, for the last 10 years. But for others, they've been working at this for much, much longer. So I'm going to start with some sobering statistics. Hopefully you recognize this island, South Island. We're on it right now. The reason I chose this picture was because it represents 1/5 of our population. And there's about 1 million people on this island. And 1/5 of our population is also the number of people in any one given year who are struggling with a mental health issue. That's depression, anxiety, ADHD, bipolar. Now, if we look at our local data and we look to see, are these numbers going up? All of the data are pointing both nationally and internationally that they're on the rise. So this is just based on the New Zealand Health Survey. We have an increase from 2006 to 2016, an increase in mood disorders by 56%, and an increase in anxiety disorders by 140%. If we look at the data on children, there was a tripling over that same decade in the number of children who are struggling with a mental health issue. I looked at data from the farming industry, and I looked at a report prepared for the Farmers' Mental Well-Being Stakeholder Group that was written in 2014. And I learned that there's a high level of stress in the farming industry, that there's a high prevalence of mood and anxiety problems that are higher than the general population, high rate of farmer suicide compared to the general population, and farmers have been found to be less likely to access mental health services. And mental health services alone were deemed unable to address all the risk factors, and that a collaborative approach was required. So, how are we going in terms of trying to address this escalating problem in our country? So here we are in Christchurch. There's a photo of it. And I like to call Christchurch the optimistic treatment gap. And that means that the population is about 400,000, and that's the number of people in any one given year who are not currently receiving any mental health services. We are currently only able to see 60% of those who are struggling. So when the report from the Ministry of Health, well, not from the Ministry of Health, the Aranga report came out, which was the inquiry into the mental health and addiction, and it's been given to the government, and the government is likely to respond in the next month. They had many recommendations, 40 recommendations, including more options for talk therapies. And as a clinical psychologist, that's the kind of thing that's music to my ears. That's exciting. Yes, they want more of us. Increase access to psychotherapy beyond the most severe cases, because we as psychologists can only reach 3 to 5% of those people who are struggling. The lack of available services, especially talk therapies, was blamed for much of the perceived ineffectiveness and inefficiency of the current system. So they're basically saying that if we can only all have more access to therapists, then we can resolve the problem that we currently have in our country. But let's just go through and say, is this feasible? Is this a realistic way to try to resolve this problem? We have 3,000 psychologists currently registered in New Zealand. And so that means that if you think about that 1 million, we have 1 psychologist for every 312 people. Now, a psychologist realistically working full-time can see between 60 to 80 people per year. Now we have other allied health professionals, and they might be able to see the same number. And so that is why I came up with that optimistic treatment gap, the number of people we simply can't see. So our government might say, well then let's just increase the number of psychologists. Let's double it. But is that realistic? I currently train clinical psychologists in New Zealand. We graduate at the University of Canterbury between 10 to 12 students per year. Okay? That's 60 to 70 nationally. So do you think that we can resolve this problem simply by training more psychologists? Even if we were to double that number, which would be a challenge in terms of trying to find them internships, etc. Realistically, it would take us until 2040 in order to just meet the current needs of our population. So that's not even taking into consideration an increase in the number of people who are going to be living in New Zealand by 2040. And it's also making an assumption that people are going to work full-time and they're going to stay in New Zealand. So I guess I love to hear about how this should be the solution, but I actually realistically did the numbers and said, I don't think that we can achieve it by talking one-to-one. We need to fundamentally change the way we are currently thinking about mental illness. So meanwhile, we use medications. So that's our frontline form of treatment. 13% of our adult population in New Zealand is currently taking an antidepressant. And that number has been going up. So if we look at the number from 2007 to 2016, we've had an increase by 48% in the number of people in our country who are on antidepressant, and an increase of 40% of people on an antipsychotic. Now, if this treatment was working well, and I do need to say that in some cases, these medications save lives. But if they were truly effective, that is, that when people went on them, their mood problems were resolved, their anxiety problems were resolved, we would not have an increasing number of people who were struggling with mental health problems. We wouldn't have an increase in the number of people who are on disability as a direct consequence of an underlying psychiatric disorder. So we do need to soberingly look at these data and say, yes, they're helping, but they're not adequately addressing the problem. If we look at the short-term data, that is, studies that are done 8 weeks, 10 weeks, the news story is positive when it comes to medications. They tend to do better than a placebo. And you can look at that in terms of stimulant medications, antidepressants, anxiolytics. But if we look at the long-term data, because people are on these medications for years, when we look at the stimulant data, this is 16-year follow-up, we find that the children who were medicated with stimulants are no better off than children who were never medicated with these drugs who have ADHD. Or if we look at the data on antidepressants, we find that the number of people who are struggling has not gone down over the last 50 years, despite the advent of medications. We've had no impact whatsoever in terms of recovery and relapse rates. And then if we look at the antipsychotics, we see the same picture. People who are on them long-term don't do as well as people who are tapered off of these medications. And there's just more and more studies that I can show you showing the same bleak picture. So, as the report concluded, rightly so, we can't medicate or treat our way out of the epidemic of mental distress. So, is there a better way? I think it's time for us to revisit a really old idea, and that is that nutrition is relevant to our brain. So if we think about the brain and its metabolic needs, it accounts for 2% of our body weight, but in terms of its metabolic requirements, it is the hungriest organ. between 20 to 50% of the glucose and nutrients that you consume are going directly to your brain so that you can concentrate here today, so that you can regulate your mood, so you can regulate anxiety, sleep well. 1 liter of blood is entering your brain every minute. That's 60 liters of blood every hour that your heart is beating. And what is it doing? Can foods like this bring adequate nutrition to your brain? These foods that 25% of our adolescents are consuming, not 25%, sorry, that 25% of their calories come from these types of foods. We often think about our food from the macronutrient perspective. That is carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. That's been the sort of the talk about food over the last, certainly in my lifetime. This is what I always thought about food when I was a child. And I think this has been detrimental to our health, this focus on just the carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. Because it means that we don't think about the micronutrients. We're not thinking about the vitamins and minerals in food. We're just thinking about the food from a perspective of calories, but not how nutrient dense that food is. And so if we thought about micronutrients, we would recognize that micronutrients are essential for making neurotransmitters like dopamine and serotonin that we know are so important for regulation of mood and for regulation of your attention, your sleep, also important for production of enzymes and hormones. And so what I was asked to give a talk to a group of year 8 school children. And I thought, how do I get this message across around how important it is to think about these micronutrients? So I decided to put it together as a graph and put here, you've got the vitamins and minerals down here, or some of them. I wasn't able to fit them all on, just to select. And I thought about some foods, and I put it relative to the recommended dietary allowance, or the RDA. Now, I'm not a big fan of RDA, and I'll explain why, but at least this will illustrate the point. So here it is at 100% of RDA. That is to prevent yourself from getting a frank nutritional deficiency. But it can go above that, and in my opinion, that's really okay. So if we look at kiwi fruit, really well known for vitamin C, and you see that it's actually above RDA. It's fantastic. You can get a lot of vitamin C from your kiwi fruit, 200 milligrams, I think it is. We look at strawberries, we get lots of nutrients, micronutrients from strawberries. Apples, sadly, aren't as nourishing, and I think that's got to do with the way we select them for transportation and storage, being good at being able to store well, transport well. But Brussels sprouts, there's a good reason why our grandmother tells us to eat those Brussels sprouts. They are really nourishing and nutrient dense. Salmon, great opportunity getting some good minerals, and steak, lots of minerals and vitamins in there. Kale is being identified as a superfood. There's a colleague of mine, there you go, look at that. Do you see again that? Kale, superfood. A colleague of mine wrote a book, honestly, a psychiatrist in the States, 50 Shades of Kale. So if you are wondering, what do I do with kale, then certainly have a look at that book. Brazil nuts, we know we can get our selenium from Brazil nuts. Selenium, it was incredibly depleted in our soils in New Zealand. Now here's donut, not a lot. There's a bit of fortification, but not a lot of nutrients. Hot dogs, nothing, not much there. English muffin, a little bit, again, probably due to fortification. And then the last one, if you're ready for it, this is Coca-Cola. Was there anything in there? I'm going to try a joke that really didn't work with those year 8s, but I said to them, there's a reason why Coca-Cola is called Coke Zero. 0 nutrients. No, it didn't go down well with you guys either. Okay. I'm going to have to stop that joke. It's just not happening. All right. So if we think about dopamine pathway, this dopamine is an important neurotransmitter that we need for attention in particular, concentration, but other things as well, regulating even our emotions, aggression. And if we look at the nutrients that are required as cofactors for these chemical reactions to occur, you see that there's all of these nutrients: magnesium, zinc, vitamin C, B6, copper, iron. So If you're not getting those nutrients, those micronutrients from your food, then you can see that that's going to influence your body's ability to make these neurotransmitters. Here's the serotonin pathway, important for regulation of mood. Again, we need these nutrients, so important to make the serotonin. And again, will a diet that's calorie-rich and nutrient-poor provide those nutrients that are required? And that was just a small part of the serotonin pathway. So there's all those other chemical reactions that are occurring. And all of those reactions, these need these nutrients, these micronutrients, for them to function optimally. So the obvious solution from here, from just this what I've told you so far, is that we should just tell everyone to be eating better. And I think that would be such a fantastic start. But I don't know in the way that we are currently making food, and the requirement that we make foods that are going to grow quickly, high yield, transport well, is necessarily going to be as nourishing as it could have been, say, 100 years ago. What do we know, though, around if you eat a healthy diet, one that is close to Mediterranean diet, that is one that's got a lot of healthy fats and fish and nuts and fruit and vegetables? We know that people who eat these types of foods, the data, the epidemiological studies, ones that look at thousands of people and look at their dietary patterns, they look to see whether or not that's correlated with mental health problems. We know that it's a protective factor, eating these types of foods. And we know that there's also studies that show that the more you eat what we call the Western diet, which is highly processed, and that it is high in takeaways and fizzy drinks and low in fruits and vegetables, it's been identified as a really important risk factor for developing mental illness. And the studies that have been done have not just been what we call cross-sectional, that is, that they're done at the same time, they're also longitudinal. We find that what you eat today is going to predict your mental health in 4 years' time, 5 years' time. So it is a very, very important thing to think about is what we're eating, because it will influence the risk of you developing a mental health problem down the road. And we've seen this, there's data that shows this in adolescents. The data that is really, really important to me at the moment, because we're doing some research with women who are struggling with mood disorders during pregnancy, that what that mother eats during pregnancy predicts the mental health of her offspring. So that means the more that she eats a Western type of diet during pregnancy, that increases the risk that her child is going to struggle with behavioral problems, anxiety, depression. There's been some amazing research that's been done just over the last couple of years that's shown that the more you eat, can shift yourself towards a Mediterranean diet, that can have a positive influence on your mood. So this study that was called the SMILES trial, which is a great name for a trial, was done by Felice Jacka, who's in Melbourne. Her team randomized people who were struggling with depression and who were eating poorly, and randomized them to receive either dietary advice on how to switch over to a Mediterranean-style diet or to get social support. And what these graphs show is that those who were randomized to the diet intervention had a much greater drop in their depression scores than those people who were receiving just the social support. And 32% of those on the diet intervention went into remission versus 8% in the control group. The important thing in science is that things get replicated, and the wonderful thing was that a year later, that study was replicated by a group in Adelaide led by Natalie Parletta. And they showed again that the people who had been randomized to receive group intervention, that is learning how to cook, learning how to use the Mediterranean-style diet in their cooking and in what they were eating, showed much greater changes in their mood relative to a group of people, their control group, who received social support. So nutrition is relevant, and if we change our diet, that can have in itself a positive effect on our mental health. So absolutely, we need to be telling people to be eating better. So it's important, but it may not be enough, as I was saying. We've been choosing our foods based on not how nutrient dense they are, but how well they move, how pretty they are. You know, you look at an apple and does it have any bruises? And we look at its aesthetic qualities, but we're not thinking about, is this going to nourish me well? Sadly, we don't always remineralize our soils with all of the trace elements, and that can influence how nourishing our fruit and vegetables are going to be. There's the use of Roundup internationally, these herbicides and pesticides, which are known as chelators. They can pull the nutrients out of the plant. Climate change, the increase in carbon dioxide, there's research that's showing that influences the nutrient density of our food and not in a good way. And then there's individual factors, that we're all genetically different. And so my nutritional needs may very well be different from the nutritional needs of individuals in this audience. And so we need to take that into account as well. I think about, in the way I like to illustrate this idea, is that on those voyages in the 1600s where sailors were dying from scurvy, if they were all genetically identical, I would say they would have all died, but only 40% of them died of scurvy. So that, to me, suggests that it's not just about their diet, because they would have been eating a very similar types of foods. So there were people who were on those ships who maybe were more robust to deal with nutrient deficiencies that were occurring in their food, whereas others were more vulnerable to the depletion in vitamin C that they were receiving. The health of our gut. You may have heard of things like leaky gut and having inflammation in our gut. That influences the bacteria that are in our gut, and that can influence how well we can absorb the vitamins and minerals that we do get out of our food. And then these organelles that are in every one of our cells, they're called mitochondria. They require vitamins and minerals in order to function optimally and to produce a chemical that's known as ATP that's so important for production of energy so that we can just get on with our day, concentrate, regulate our mood. So all of these factors could result in fewer nutrients available to support brain health. So it was mentioned earlier that I did my PhD at the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada. And when I was there, there were some families who had serious mental health problems in their families, like bipolar disorder and psychosis. And they claimed that they could treat these serious conditions just with nutrients. And they went and they thought, we've got such a great idea here. And in fact, they were from an agricultural background, so this may not be any surprise to you that when animals get really irritable, we ensure they're really well fed and nourished with nutrients. We give them broad spectrum of micronutrients. And that can reduce their irritability and other problems that can occur. So they decided to take that concept and apply it to humans, because medications were simply not adequately supporting the mental health of their children, their grandchildren. And when they did this, they found that their children were getting better. And so they approached scientists. And one of the people they approached was my supervisor, Professor Bonnie Kaplan at the University of Calgary. And she initially said, this is just snake oil. We would have figured this one out if this was so relevant to mental health. But she decided to do some very preliminary trials. And she and others published these preliminary data in the earlier part of this century, showing people getting well and staying well just with nutrients. And so I decided, after I had moved to New Zealand. I'd done my PhD in 1998. I moved to Toronto, and then I came to New Zealand in 2000. I was doing completely different research. But I thought, you know what? Based on my own data and data of other people, I was noticing that not enough people were getting well with our current gold standard approach. And I talked about that at the beginning of this talk. So I thought, what do I have to lose? I am a scientist. I am one of the critics and conscious of society. And I'm going to study something no matter how controversial and no matter how much it contravened our current way of thinking. So we took this approach, let's use a broad spectrum of micronutrients. We give them in pills, and we give them typically above the recommended daily allowance. There's nothing secret in them. There's vitamins and minerals, some amino acids, but often at doses higher than the RDA, and I talked about that earlier. But in some trials, we found that 4 capsules is sufficient. For example, some of the studies that we've done on stress. So it doesn't have to be 12, but that's our target with people who are really struggling with chronic mental health issues. So I mentioned about RDA. It prevents you from getting a frank nutritional deficiency. It'll prevent you from getting scurvy or rickets, but it doesn't identify what is going to be optimal for brain health. So we know a lot about the RDA for bone health, but surprisingly, despite it being the hungriest organ, we know very little about what its nutritional needs are. But we think, based on our research, that it's probably higher than RDA. We think that's probably the therapeutic range. And we're typically working in this range, not often over what we call the UL. The UL is a number, a very conservative number that is identified to say if you start going over that number, then you're more likely to get some side effects. So if you were to go over the UL for magnesium, you may know, some of you, that one of the side effects of taking too much magnesium is diarrhea. So that's generally not a good thing, so you don't want to go too high. And what we've shown is that, well, we did some research right after the Christchurch earthquakes, and we reduced the rates of post-traumatic stress disorder symptoms in people who had been taking the micronutrients from 65% down to 19% with a 1-month intervention with micronutrients, with no change in those people who chose to go down the medication psychotherapy route. No change. It's powerful. Powerful change. And then even 1 year later, those people who had acutely taken those micronutrients were doing better than those who didn't. So these data, alongside data that we collected after a flood in Calgary, Alberta, Canada, in 2013, they tell me that a really good way to address the mental health issues and needs of a community following a natural disaster is by simply ensuring that they're well nourished. That's so essential. And maybe additional nutrients, cheap way of reaching a lot of people. And sadly, after the terrorist attacks here in Christchurch, I tried to, I pleaded with the local, the Christchurch mayor, the local community, and sadly, they didn't listen. They haven't decided that this would be a good way to try to help reduce the stress and trauma associated with this event. So I'm going through other channels to try to make a difference and to bring this research to the people who need it. So we wonder whether or not in a time of stress that we need to ensure that the brain is well fed. The fight-flight response gets really activated, and of course it's so important because it's about survival. So all of our nutrients are going to go to feed that system. And so in a time of high stress or even chronic stress, the fight-flight response that, you get that anxiety that it's so important in terms of trying to, get away and flee, that means that there's less available for the rest of the functions in your body, like mood regulation, like sleep. And so we think, if we give more nutrients at a time of high stress, maybe that's why we observed those really strong and beneficial effects of additional nutrients. And I think about it like a triage theory, system, that when you go to an emergency room, we always treat the most serious injuries first. Same thing with our body. It's going to ensure that the fight-flight response gets everything at the expense of other functions. So we've done research where we've compared micronutrients to placebo because that is so important to do these randomized controlled trials. that will convince people that this is relevant, that nutrition is relevant to the brain. And by doing these types of blinded trials, just like you would in testing an antidepressant, that we are showing that it's relevant and very important. So about 50% of people in this study, this was a short-term study with ADHD adults, we showed that 50% of them had a strong response, a beneficial impact on their symptoms in that short amount of time compared to about 20% in the placebo. And then we replicated almost identical results with children, slightly more stronger placebo effect in kids. We ran a study that we published just last year where we looked at whether or not we could help people quit smoking. And here I show the data of the micronutrients versus placebo. After 4 weeks, about 65% of the people who had been randomized to the micronutrients had completely quit smoking for the entire time, no relapses, versus about 40% of those on the placebo. The 12-week quit rate wasn't as good. We know that people do relapse over that time, but we still had 40% of them absolutely smoke-free for that 3-month period who had been given the micronutrients versus just over 20% of the placebo. But let me share with you the data of the things that are currently funded by our government. Nicotine replacement therapy is no better in terms of the rates than our placebo. Champix, another funded drug in New Zealand, is as good as our placebo. We had almost a twice as good a rate with the micronutrients. I have tried to get these nutrients funded by Pharmac, but so far they've said no, even though we've collected data now for 10 years, not just in my lab, but also overseas. They say I just need more data, so I'll keep going. There's been research that's shown that we can reduce aggression in prisoners, that we can slow cognitive decline in the elderly with micronutrients, and that we can help people in terms of their mood, anxiety, stress, and ADHD. And these studies have been done all over the world. And all studies that have been done that have targeted people with a mental health problem have been positive. The only negative trials, that is where there's been no difference between the micronutrients and the placebo, have been studies that have not studied people who have a mental health problem to begin with. So where does this leave us? There was a case study, they called him Andrew, and Andrew presented to the Alberta Children's Hospital, and he had serious psychotic symptoms. He was a 10-year-old boy, and he was admitted there, and he was kept there for 6 months, and every treatment under every type of conventional treatment, all the gold standard medications were tried with Andrew to try to reduce his psychotic symptoms and his obsessive and compulsive symptoms that he presented with. He was identified as one of the worst cases they'd ever seen in the inpatient unit. After 6 months of completely unsuccessful treatment with these conventional approaches, he was discharged, and his mother was told that she needed to quit her job and look after him full time. At that point, Andrew and his family heard about the micronutrients, and they gave it a go. And over the next 6 months, all of his psychotic symptoms and his obsessive and compulsive symptoms were completely eliminated. And that has now been sustained now. I think we're now at about 8 years later. He's graduated from high school, he has a job. I tell you this story about this one case because the cost of the micronutrients was less than 2% of the cost of that unsuccessful 6-month stay. So the cost savings alone of this approach should make it so that our governments and those who fund mental health treatments should be really paying attention. We've helped people as I said, all over New Zealand. This is Tim Webb. He was in featured in The Listener and also on a Sunday report about our work, about how his absolute huge change that occurred when he went on micronutrients. He had severe anxiety, he self-harmed, he had ADHD, and he's still doing well. I think we're now close to 10 years later. And then, as I mentioned, we're doing a study right now using micronutrients with women who are struggling with depression and anxiety during pregnancy to see if they can alleviate those symptoms. But we're also interested in the effects of being well nourished during pregnancy with these nutrients on the infant outcomes. And so this study is still ongoing, but I just wanted to show you that these are some of our micronutrient babies, and they are incredibly healthy and emotionally regulated, and such a pleasure to work with these families and seeing that we can have some positive outcomes, not only for the mother's mental health, but also for the outcomes of her offspring. Some people often say to me, oh, you know what, and I hear this all the time, is that, well, you know, micronutrients, really? Can they really be that powerful in terms of completely turning someone's life around from being psychotic to not psychotic? And they don't believe these case stories, and they don't believe our data. And so I came up and I thought, well, how do you convince people that nutrition is relevant to who we are, to our brain, to our physical health? And so I came up with this analogy. I thought, okay, well, we've got the queen bee and we've got the worker bee. They are what we call phenotypically different, but genetically identical. The queen bee is fertile and the worker bee is sterile. I'd say, I hope you agree with me, that that's a pretty substantial difference. And what is it that makes the difference between the queen bee and the worker bee? Royal jelly. That's it. That's the difference. The queen bee is fed the royal jelly. And so that's a nutrient intervention that can have a huge impact on outcome. So don't ever say that nutrients can't be powerful. So I've shared with you a little bit of our work, and I just wanted to share with you as well of where we're going. Why and for whom might this approach work? Because it doesn't work for everyone, the micronutrient intervention. It's a bit of a shotgun approach. We're giving the same nutrients to everyone. So we're trying to better understand through looking at serum, looking at blood biomarkers. Can we predict who's going to be those responders and who's going to be that 20% of people that we see where we don't have any impact whatsoever? So we're looking also at the microbiome. We're looking at whether or not the bacteria can tell us tell us about what might be going on with internally. Do we change the diversity of the bacteria with micronutrients? So we're starting to investigate that with our current studies. We're looking at genetics, and in particular, we're interested in, well, first of all, whether or not there's any any genetic differences that might predict who might be a responder and who might not. We haven't uncovered anything yet, and I'm not hopeful on that front. But we're also interested in whether or not genes can be turned on or off by our environment. We call this epigenetics, and so this is something that we're exploring at the moment to say, can nutrition turn genes on and off? Well, we know from the example I gave you with the worker bee and the queen bee that absolutely our genes can be influenced by our environment. We're doing imaging studies to better understand what changes might be going on in the brain. We're interested in seeing whether or not we're having a positive effect in re-energizing those mitochondria, and we're also interested in whether or not the micronutrients can reduce inflammation. So here is the conventional medicine approach. This is what we do now. And I'm hoping that we can get to a place where we change this. We turn it upside down and we start to emphasize how important lifestyle is, being socially connected, thinking about what we're eating, ensuring that we exercise, use supplements when required, psychotherapy to help learn strategies to reduce our stress, and then use medications when these approaches don't work. And I just hope that in my lifetime, there'll be a time where perhaps micronutrients might be funded through our public healthcare system for those who need it. So from your perspective, can we have some basic questions to ask about food? This is the wrong audience to be, because you hopefully already know this, but to think, is this real food that I'm eating? Can I tell if it was grown in a field or an orchard? Is there more than one ingredient? That might be a clue. Are there numbers in the ingredient list? Does it have a star rating? Now, star ratings can be really, really helpful, but they tend to be put on more likely to be used with highly processed foods like your cereals versus being put on fruit and vegetables. Is there a lot of processed refined sugar in the product like fizzy drinks? And ultimately, would my grandmother recognize it as food? There are so many examples in history where people have suggested a really radical idea. Like Pythagoras suggested that the world was round, or Jean-Baptiste Lamarck suggested that maybe we can change our genes. Not in the way he said it that way, but he's now probably seen as the father of epigenetics. Or John Harrison, who suggested that we can identify longitude, or I think it's longitude, using a clock on ships, and this idea wasn't recognized until he was in his 80s. Ignaz Semmelweis suggested that we should wash our hands before touching a pregnant woman in order to prevent childbed fever. He was actually ostracized for this idea. His medical colleagues refused to accept that it was important to wash our hands, and he ended up in an asylum where he died there at the age of 47 from septicemia. Or Alfred Wegener, who suggested that the Earth is moving and that we've got these plate tectonics, and that's been fundamentally important in understanding earthquakes and other things. Or Barry Marshall, who challenged the way we understand the development of ulcers. So can we ultimately, though, thinking about that treatment gap, afford to wait for people to change and start to recognize that nutrition is so relevant to our brain? Randomized trials in the 1600s showed that putting limes aboard ships headed out for long voyages completely eliminated that 40% mortality I had talked about from scurvy. But it took the British government 264 years to mandate that all ships must carry citrus for their sailors. So how long is it going to take our society to recognize that suboptimal nutrition is contributing to our current epidemic of mental illness? It's our choice. Every time we put something in our mouths, we make a choice to offer ourselves something nourishing or nutrient depleted. As Buckminster Fuller stated, you never change things by fighting the existing reality. To change something, build a new model that makes the existing model obsolete. Thank you.